So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's really interesting event. My name is Ciobanu, and I am the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And I would like to welcome all of you to this really wonderful, very important event entitled Nuclear Dangers in Ukraine. This is our first conversation in a series which will cover, among other topics, the dangers of a NATO-imposed No Fly Zone to protect civilian corridors of escape and the risks of an intentional or accidental missile attack on Ukraine's nuclear power facilities. This event will bring concerns about nuclear dangers to the greater public, in keeping in line with our organization's central mission of promoting nuclear abolition. Our speakers for today's conversation are Cynthia Lazaroff and Richard Falk, and I'd like to briefly highlight our two esteemed speakers. Cynthia is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, founder of Women Transforming Our Nuclear Legacy. She's the author of A Dawn of a New Armageddon, a personal account of the Hawaii missile scare, published in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist on August 6, 2018. She's also an expert on U.S.-Russian relations, including the history, geopolitics, military, cyber, and escalating nuclear risks between these two countries. Cynthia has been engaged in Track 2, citizen diplomacy, and mediation efforts with Russia since the early 1980s. Our second speaker is Richard Falk, who's an American professor of international law at Princeton University, where he taught for 40 years, and the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor's chair of the Board of Trustees. In 2008, the United Nations Human Rights Council appointed him to a 6-year term as a UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. He's the author or co-author of more than 20 books. His memoir, Public Intellectual, Life of a Citizen Pilgrim, was published last year. Before I give the floor to Cynthia, as a really brief reminder, please turn off your cameras and mute yourself. Also, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. Now I would like to give the floor to Cynthia, who will share her remarks about the current situation in Ukraine. Please, Cynthia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. It's really an honor to be here with you and Richard and everyone present on the call today. And I'm so deeply grateful to the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation for convening this conversation. It's so important right now to be doing this. And I'm honored to have just joined you all on the board of the foundation to support our mission dedicated to peace and the abolition of nuclear weapons as we move forward together into the 5th decade of the foundation's work. And I just want to take a moment before talking about Ukraine to honor Richard Falk, because without Richard, I literally wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be doing this work. I would have never started doing this work. Richard is the first person who awakened me to nuclear dangers way back when, in the 1970s, when I was his student at Princeton. And he was the first to inspire me to become an activist for nuclear disarmament. So Richard, I just want to thank you and say deep bows of gratitude to you for inspiring me and countless people around the world for so many years with your brilliance, your tireless devotion to peace, justice, and the abolition of nuclear weapons. This is pure joy for me because the learning continues in every conversation I have with you. And I know I'm not alone. There are so many who wouldn't be here doing this work without you. So blessings, gratitude, and deep bows. Thank you so much, Richard. So when we look at nuclear risks in Ukraine, I think it's essential that we put them in the context of the overall current nuclear danger. A few years ago, when I was producing the film US-Russia Relations: Quest for Stability, I interviewed dozens of top experts in the US and Russia, and pretty much everyone I spoke to sounded the alarm on today's escalating nuclear danger. Former US Secretary of Defense William Perry said to me that today the danger of some sort of nuclear catastrophe is greater than it was during the Cold War, and that most people are blissfully unaware of this danger. He said, "We are allowing ourselves to sleepwalk into another catastrophe. We must wake up." The US and Russia still possess over 90% of the world's estimated 13,000 nuclear weapons. We still have the dangers that existed during the Cold War, such as the risk of inadvertent nuclear war due to accident, blunder, miscalculation, or mistake. And we still have ICBMs on launch on warning postures, with the presidents having just minutes to decide upon receiving warning of a nuclear attack. And these missiles have triggered many false alarms in the past. Plus, we have a whole set of new dangers that didn't exist during the Cold War. These include destabilizing new weapons and missile defense systems, cyber warfare, and the cyber nuclear nexus, emerging technologies, and more. So now let's come to Ukraine. We're in a moment of extremely high tensions, in some ways more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And as we move into the second month of the war, I'm most concerned about two things. First, we have to find our way to a ceasefire to stop the killing, bloodshed, and immense human suffering. And I'm deeply concerned about the risk of escalation, which could lead to a nuclear exchange. We have both state and non-state actors who could take action that could escalate the conflict inadvertently or intentionally. We have large numbers of NATO and Russian troops now in close proximity in the region, and this multiplies the risk of possible incidents of escalation. And we have uncertainty about where the red lines are for NATO and for Russia. There are so many pathways to escalation, any one of which could trigger a spiral up the escalatory ladder to a potentially catastrophic nuclear confrontation. I'm going to just give a few examples, and these represent only a tiny fraction of what could go wrong. So 3 ways that NATO might be drawn into the war besides a no-fly zone that we've also heard so much about. We understand that if NATO gets involved, it would be the start of World War III. And when you have nuclear armed countries involved in a conflict with high tensions and limited communications, the risk of miscalculation dramatically increases in the fog of war. And we can imagine how things might spiral out of control and escalate to a nuclear exchange. So the first example, Russia attacks weapon shipments coming into Ukraine from NATO countries. And this results in a direct combat between a NATO country and Russian troops. Russia has already said that they consider these legitimate targets. And with all the weapons pouring into Ukraine, I think this is an increasingly likely possibility the longer the war goes on. Number 2, a Russian attack on a Ukrainian nuclear power plant triggers a large release of radiation across Europe. Number 3, Russia uses chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. I'm going to come back to nuclear weapons, but first I want to go to another possible escalatory scenario. A state or a non-state actor launches a crippling cyber attack on infrastructure in the US, on our NATO allies, or on Russia. There is a potential here for the cyber nuclear nexus. The Nuclear Threat Initiative has published a must-read hypothetical scenario of how this nexus could escalate the war in Ukraine to a catastrophic nuclear war. And I'm going to put this and other links in the chat so that you can refer to them after this call. Another concern is the ambiguity in weapon systems that can lead to miscalculation and escalation, such as dual capable missiles that can carry both conventional and nuclear warheads that Russia's already now using in Ukraine. And there's no way to know what kind of warhead is mounted on the missile until it strikes its target. Similarly, there's no way to know when a nuclear missile is launched, whether it's a low yield tactical or a higher yield strategic nuclear weapon until it hits its target. I want to shift now to a question on everyone's mind. Would President Putin actually push the button? Would he intentionally launch nuclear weapons? I gave a talk yesterday, and today my answer is somewhat different than yesterday for 2 reasons. One, today we have news of some progress in peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. And yesterday, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov somewhat qualified Moscow's nuclear saber rattling when he said, quote, "Any outcome of the operation, of course, is not a reason for usage of a nuclear weapon. We have a security concept that very clearly states that only when there is a threat for the existence of the state in our country, we can use and will actually use nuclear weapons to eliminate the threat for our existence of our country." Peskov's statement might be interpreted as a reassuring signal, but what precisely would constitute an existential threat for Russia is not known, especially in a moment of escalation in the fog of this war. So to come back to the question of whether Vladimir Putin would actually push the button, the probability is low, but the risk is not zero. And I believe the longer this war goes on, there is an increasing possibility of some kind of escalation that could lead to intentional nuclear use. And the more Putin feels frustrated, pressured, backed into a corner, the more he feels like he's losing, the more his perception is that he and Russia are threatened, I think the more likely we could see a possible escalation to nuclear use. It might start as what's known as a demonstration, a single launch into an uninhabited area like the Baltic Sea, or worse on military targets in Ukraine, or worse yet, even onto staging areas for weapons deliveries in NATO countries. How would the US and NATO respond to something like this? We don't know, but a video simulation done at Princeton starts with just one launch by Russia during a conventional conflict and escalates to a nuclear war with 90 million dead and injured within the first few hours. And this is just the first few hours. We have to end this war to make sure that we don't have an escalation that could lead to something like this or worse. So some quick recommendations for going forward right now. We need to reduce the risk of escalation, and we need to prioritize diplomacy, dialogue, and negotiations to secure a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Russian troops, and to work out all the points of a peace agreement. To achieve this, we need better and more open channels of communication at all levels, diplomatic and military. Nuclear risk never goes away. It's omnicidal behavior to stop talking to your nuclear adversary at any time. And words matter. We need to stop the inflammatory and escalatory rhetoric on all sides. This is a planetary nuclear wake-up call. The only way to prevent one person or 9 nuclear armed countries from holding the whole world hostage and unleashing nuclear Armageddon is to abolish, eliminate, and ban nuclear weapons forever. If we survive this, we will have another chance to get this right and move as quickly as possible toward the total elimination of nuclear weapons. It's a moral and existential imperative that we support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. As the calls for more weapons and more defense spending rise across the US and Europe, I have no illusions about the formidable obstacles in the way of achieving this. Our work in the peace and the nuclear abolition movements may be harder now, but if we stand together, it'll be easier. And I want to just end with a quote by Dmitry Muratov, the editor-in-chief of Russia's independent newspaper, Novaya Gazeta, who won the Nobel Peace Prize last fall, who has called for us to stand together in this moment. He said, quote, "Only a global anti-war movement can save life on this planet." Yesterday, we learned that Dmitry had to suspend publication of Novaya Gazeta under enormous pressure. But we have to stand with Dmitry and build this global anti-war movement together. Our work is more important now than ever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for those really important and insightful remarks. Next, I would like to ask Richard to share his perspective. Please, Richard, the floor is yours.
Mute.
Thank you very much, Christian, for your introduction. And Cynthia, as I've told you before, the greatest joy of a teacher is for the student to surpass his whatever he has achieved. And you are a superlative example of one who has done that. So it gives me great satisfaction to share this program with you. You mentioned at the very beginning this arresting quote from William Perry about sleepwalking into a nuclear disaster. Almost in some sense, intellectually and politically worse is entering this domain of heightened nuclear risk knowingly. And psychiatrists tell us that you should focus not on what you can't change very much, which is the Russian behavior, and focus on what you can change, which is the US behavior, which has been, in my view, irresponsible at the highest levels and the highest public levels since this terrible aggression against Ukraine began. And it, rather than seeking what Cynthia stressed, the imperative, both the humanitarian imperative and the political imperative of avoiding escalation, should have focused on a diplomatic path from the very beginning and emphasized the urgency of stopping the devastation and the killing. If you carefully consider what President Biden has been saying, both to the Congress in the State of the Union address and to the Europeans and NATO, it has been a mobilization for confrontation. It has deplored the aggression, which is natural to do, but it hasn't coupled that with any sense, either prudential sense or moral and legal sense of trying to end the conflict on the ground. And it's led me to the view that one really has entered an era of two-level wars. The war on the ground is what the media and especially TV focus upon because it gives these vivid images of death and destruction. And we're visited with those daily on an almost obsessive basis. But what's ignored is what I call the geopolitical war that is going on between Russia and the US and interacts with the war on the ground, but is quite separate in several ways. One of the ways, which was, I think, accidentally signaled by Biden when he said that that it's necessary to get rid of Putin as the leader, is the hope that the reaction against Ukraine will lead to regime change in Russia. Now that is he's backed away from that statement, but one has to assume that it was deliberate when it was uttered, or else that would be scary too, to have a leader that is so uncensored with respect to the kind of inflammatory comments that can produce escalation. And in this geopolitical war, where there is no, at the present time, no killing and devastation, rhetoric is the path to escalation. And so when Russia talks about the possibilities of using tactical nuclear weapons, or when Biden speaks about getting rid of Putin as the Russian leader, as a kind of precondition for restored order, or he speaks of prosecuting war crimes, he is escalating the confrontation on this second level, which could be the most dangerous level. As horrible as the events in the Ukraine are concerned, they're confined geographically and so far in the quality of the military interaction. But if the geopolitical level of the conflict gets out of hand, it very quickly goes to weapons of mass destruction. And it's extraordinary in that it's given no attention, that there is no critique in the media of this failure to open the possibility of a diplomatic path being pursued. And it's actually, if one's fair-minded about it, it's Russia and Ukraine that have been more open to the reality and the necessity of a negotiated end. And it's the US that's been on this cheerleading the increase in military spending, in cheering the European, especially German, commitment to a more militarist approach for NATO as a whole. And so that what one sees in this geopolitical level of conflict are different objectives than ending the violence. One sees the mobilization of a reinvigorated NATO, and one sees the idea of the US continuing to be in charge of global security, not even the defense of Europe and the defense of the West, but whether it's Taiwan or anywhere in the world, what I've called a Monroe Doctrine for the world, that now seems to be the geopolitical major premise of the United States in this Trump-Biden period of trying to take advantage of the earlier collapse of the Soviet Union. And what this really means is that one is challenging the traditional geopolitics of spheres of influence, which we should remember were what kept the peace in the Cold War. As horrible as the events in Eastern Europe were, including the intervention in Hungary in 1956, in East Europe and Poland, and the Czech Republic at other times, there was always the realization that one should respect that as a Soviet sphere of influence. With the end of the Cold War and the triumphalism of the West, we took the rather radical position that only we have a sphere of influence, only we, the United States, and that sphere of influence extends to the planet as a whole. And I really think that we are at a moment when we should recognize that the part of the path to peace is not only resolving what is happening in Ukraine, but is trying to live in a multipolar world and address the climate change and other issues on the basis of global cooperation and accommodation. That doesn't mean one has to endorse or accept even other ways of governing societies, as in China or Russia. But one has to recognize that in a world with nuclear weapons, to challenge the other geopolitical actors is to engage in unacceptable risk-generating behavior. Cynthia spoke so eloquently about the specifics of the nuclear danger that I can't do better than echo what her warnings and escalatory pathways depicted. I really think that she touched all the relevant bases, except to some extent what I've been trying to talk about in terms of these geopolitical friction points that, if they got out of hand, would really mean a world war or even something worse than that. And I think that one of the things that's at stake here is the whole idea of non-proliferation as an acceptable form of political stability. There's been much speculation as to whether Ukraine would have been attacked had it possessed nuclear weapons. And Libya, the same, which had given up a rather advanced nuclear program. Both of these countries were attacked. And one doubts that Iraq would have been attacked by the United States in 2003 if it possessed nuclear weapons. So on the one side, the non-proliferation regime seems to be inadequate for countries under threat by one of these geopolitical actors. Ukraine had given up its nuclear weapons in 1994 by way of what's called the Budapest Memorandum, but it did that in exchange for an unconditional security guarantee, which has been broken. Other governments that fear some kind of friction look at this experience and suggest, wouldn't we be better off with nuclear weapons than without? Furthermore, the idea that the most dangerous countries in the world, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, are to be entrusted with the permanent possession of this nuclear weapons arsenal with full discretion to decide when it's in their interest to threaten or actually use these weapons. That seems like, even if there wasn't the proliferation issue, non-proliferation seems like a unacceptable way of establishing peace and justice in the world. Equals, if you want a regime that embodies law, equals have to be treated equally. And we're living in a state-centric system. So to give these 5 countries this kind of permanent geopolitical prerogative of launching a nuclear threat or war seems unacceptable and imprudent in addition to that. So let me end by saying that I think we are at a turning point in international experience with nuclear dimensions of war. As Cynthia mentioned, this is both more ominous in its way than the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it also may be enough to awaken much more intense concern to make this treaty for the prevention of nuclear war, which 60 countries have now signed, make the nuclear weapons governments come to their senses and ratify this treaty. And that won't happen without the kind of activism that depends on the participation of citizens in a dedicated and militant, nonviolent manner. And I hope that out of this, these terrible events and threats comes the ambition, the peace ambition to rid the world of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments, Richard. Now we're at the portion of our Q&A. Let me just add myself to the spotlight. As people are preparing to ask questions, we actually received a few questions in advance. So thank you those who submitted. And so I would like to read those first, and then we can go into the questions in the chat box. So the first question is for you, Cynthia, which is the following. It's actually 2 questions. Have you spoken to any Russian people since the invasion? And how much real news do you think is getting through to the everyday Russian citizens? And what do you think their views are, or what do they believe about the war?
So I have spoken to a number and very for
Oh, Cynthia, I think you froze.
okay, one second, I'll be back. Fix this.
So while we wait for Cynthia to deal with the technical issues, why don't we turn the floor over to you, Richard? And I think, first off, you talked about what I really liked at the end. You talked about the idea of the regime, the non-proliferation regime. And, I am a very, strong believer in the importance of regimes, having studied, Cohen's thoughts on regime making and Krasner's. And I was just wondering if you could expand more, like how can the importance of the TPNW, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and how can we really try to fix the regime in itself?
By the regime, you mean the non-proliferation?
Exactly, yes.
See, in my view, I've been a critic of the non-proliferation regime for a long time, and I believe it to be a managerial approach that aims at international stability, and it accepts the permanence of nuclear weapons in the hands of these countries that possess them. And for reasons I tried to indicate in my comments, that seems like an unacceptable arrangement in a state-centric system, And the only way it can operate at all is by exceeding the Non-Proliferation Treaty through its enforcement, selective enforcement. Eyes were closed when Israel went about acquiring nuclear weapons. Iran is threatened constantly with war if it crosses the nuclear threshold. Iran has every reason to fear for its security. And it has a good, so if you're in a state-centric, sovereignty-oriented system, by that logic, it should have that option open to it, especially when others with nuclear weapons are threatening them. North Korea is somewhat in a similar position, and it has acquired the weapons, and the threats have stopped. See, what message is sent to the world by that duality? That really those three things: the Israel narrative, the Iran narrative, and the North Korean experience. And when you put those together, it seems to me that transformative politics in terms of a phased treaty of nuclear disarmament combined with the prohibition treaty that the UN already has is the only moral and rationally coherent path for humanity to take.
Yes.
But it won't happen without a peace movement. It won't happen without a breakthrough peace movement that mobilizes sufficient pressure that governments begin to recalculate their interests.
Right, right. I completely agree. I think it's very important to take on that constructivist like approach to addressing the world. You talked about the importance of like citizen engagement and really, engaging with, with the public. So I was just wondering, how do we galvanize, Middle America? And if you could share your thoughts on like, how, because we're both on, the East and West Coast, like how can we really, engage with Middle America? And what are your thoughts about Middle America's views on the situation?
Well, I'm not I don't feel, although I began my teaching career at Ohio State and spent 6 years there, that was long before you were born, and I don't feel sufficiently in touch, but people everywhere have a stake in world peace. And it's a matter, in this sense, there is a lot of what Bill Perry called sleepwalking going on in this country and many other places too. And it's up to people, and there is a lot of activism in the Middle West, but it's up to these forces to make a greater sense of what this kind of nuclear militarism has cost the country. See, underneath what I've been saying is the second level of urgency is a humane state building project for the US. We love to build states elsewhere. We forget about our own people, and maybe most of all about the people between the two coasts. They've not only been in denial, they've also been manipulated. And we have to challenge that as best we can.
Yes.
I think Cynthia is reactivated.
Yes, I believe so. So thank you, Richard. So Cynthia, I believe you're back. You fixed, the internet. So like, let's turn back to you. So as I mentioned before, the questions were: have you spoken to any Russian people since the invasion? And your ideas of like how much real news is getting through to the everyday Russian. citizen, and what do you think their perceptions are about the war?
So thank you, and sorry for the internet problem. So I have spoken to a number of friends since the war, particularly in the earlier days, right after the war started. And I would say that it's important to understand that it's not a monolithic country by any sense of the understanding of it. And the answer really depends on demographically the age of the person, whether they have access to social media, where they get most of their news. Much of the older generation still gets its news from state media. That being said, and there have been changes as the war has gone on the access to information. There's been a shutdown of really all independent media, TV Rain, Doj TV Rain, and Echo Moskwy, the radio station, and now Nova Gazeta has, as I just mentioned, has shut down. But people are still getting information, people who especially who have VPNs, who have access to getting information on the internet. And the vast majority of the younger part of the population is on social media, so they're getting information from the outside world. So some of it's dependent on what information is coming in from the outside world. The initial reaction of so many Russians who found out and were following independent sources of media and did not rely on state-run media were three words. And Dmitry Muratov used them, but I heard them over and over again: shock, grief, and shame. And that is the experience. And when I say those words, I feel them. I feel how you really have to know that they really mean that. It's devastating. And now, as the state media as the independent media has shut down, and as the protests that we saw that are still continuing, although not as widely as we saw them, we now that there have been the laws passed that if you protest, that you can be put in prison for 15 years, or if you try to spread information that uses the word war or invasion instead of military operation. With all of these repressive measures, it's been much harder for people to actually protest, but people are protesting. There's a young journalist who's actually the daughter of Dmitry, Finley Muratova, and she publishes in The Nation, and she has a blog that covers protests in Russia. And she published an article yesterday that says that there are things going on. There are coded ways now that people are putting information about protests on media. So I want to say there's also information getting out in different ways. And I'm going to give one more example, which is that right after the invasion, there were so many groups that came out across the country with open letters opposed to the invasion. And one of them was a group of mothers of soldiers who had been sent to the war. Many conscripted into the war thinking they were going on a training exercise and didn't know they were being sent to Ukraine. And these mothers formed a group across Russia and came together from all sectors of society to oppose the war and to create an open letter. So I think that the more people, that when people find out about it, they're really heartbroken and devastated. And there are those who support Putin as well. There are people who support the government's actions, especially those who rely on state-run media. So I hope that's answered the question.
Yes, thank you so much. And then there's another question about the media. It's by Suggest Graham. How do you suggest changing the narrative in the media? Would regular citizens putting together press releases and trying to motivate the major news outlets be an avenue or option? What is already in place to support these kinds of efforts?
Who are you directed, Matt?
It's for either one of you.
Do you want to start, Richard, or I can whatever you.
You start.
Well, I think this gets to the question that Richard was talking about. and that's come up, which is the question of citizen engagement. And this is going to be up to all of us. I mean, this is the moment. We have to, it has to be, as Dimitri called for, a global anti-war movement and a global call for a change. And just as, if you really follow and believe in the mainstream media narrative, you think you don't see the more nuanced view of what's going on in this situation. You don't hear the kinds of analysis that you've gotten from Richard that, really puts this in the stakes of the whole geopolitical really future of our world. And so I think we have to take action in every way we can, and to the extent to which we can impact the mainstream media, if we can, that would be really an incredible opportunity to make a change. There's a huge difference, though, between the media today and when I came of age in the 1980s, when the media really pretty constantly fulfilled its role to inform us, its ethical responsibility to inform us on the clear and present nuclear danger. That is largely gone, and for a whole host of reasons that I won't go into. But I think that they need to be awakened. They need to be awakened to what's at stake. The media, I think, is, and it's not easy to go to sleep in the world that we live in on nuclear weapons when you're dealing with climate change and the existential threats of climate change and the pandemic and everything else. People are overwhelmed. But my prayer is that this is an awakening, and that if, we talk to everybody we know, we talk to our elected representatives. What do you know about the nuclear risk, and what are you doing about it? Do you know that we're at a greater risk than we were during the Cold War, even when we're not at war, even when there isn't a war going on? And we talk to the media, we educate them, we inform. So the extent that we can do that and impact it, we should try. But we have to also really focus on mobilizing people everywhere. And it really comes down to an understanding of what's at stake. And our lives are at stake. Everyone's life is at stake. And that's something that we have to make sure we don't forget and go to sleep on again, because this may be our last chance to wake up before it's too late, truly. And I'm not being alarmist or dramatic. We've been lucky so many times. And it's just, we can't rely on luck to save us from nuclear Armageddon. We just can't.
Richard, would you like to comment as well?
Well, I would only add that one is disturbed by the fact that the most trusted media seems to be so easily swayed by warmongering rhetoric that comes from Washington, and gives very little opportunity for peace-minded citizens to have any voice. The endless experts from retired military intelligence services and who comment on the gains and losses to be had from pursuing controversial military approaches to foreign policy. But you see very little criticism. And it puzzles me why so little, even in the most supposedly trustworthy places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN. They all are very one-sided when it comes to war-peace issues. Whether that's reflects this corporate influence that has grown in relation to the media, but our kind of political democracy cannot flourish without an independent media. So that's one of the things that we really should be worried about. And it's more specifically, it's obscuring the nuclear dangers we've been focusing on. It has given no attention to those dangers, aside from a way of highlighting the critique of Russia. And that's not constructive. We have to, as I tried to say at the beginning, we have to focus on what we can change ourselves. And that's where the most productive emphasis should be placed. So we've been failed, in my view, we've been failed by the media, and it's very difficult to gain useful access to the mainstream media at this stage for these points of view. That's why an organization like the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation is so important in this stage. It is a source of objective information and of passionate concern, and it's that combination of elements that could provide the foundation for a coherent and greatly improved approach to nuclear weapons and to the world generally.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Cynthia, I know there's a question directly to you, if you would like to answer, regarding if you could explain why you believe the current media does not fulfill its obligation.
Yeah, and I think it is, just to really briefly address that, I think that it's a number of factors. One is that the media really changed after the fairness doctrine was repealed under Reagan. And so it's not required to give a kind of balanced view of things. And I think that is a factor. I think we're also in a commercially driven, corporate owned media kind of environment now that's different than it was back then. And I think that it's a millisecond news cycle. So what is going to get the most clicks? I don't think that there's this feeling of, a greater moral and ethical responsibility for shaping what is going to happen to humanity. I don't think that's what drives the news cycle right now. So I think it's a combination of factors, but I also think a factor is that until now, maybe a lot of the journalists have been asleep, but even now it's not put in the overall nuclear danger context that I started my talk with. It's like this has just come out of nowhere almost. There's no historical context. There's no context of the overall danger that we're living with, not just as I said, when there's a war going on in Ukraine. I just wanted to say one other thing, if I might, because I see another note in the chat from Alice Slater regarding, I haven't read the whole thing, but I catch the gist of it, is that, that we have to address the climate. And one of the greatest hopes to me is that there is a huge divestment campaign, as we know, for divesting from fossil fuels, as there is for nuclear, in support of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, to divest from the funders of the nuclear weapons producers. And just to say that there's a way for our movements to really come together around divestment, because many of the same biggest offender banks funding fossil fuels are those funding nuclear weapons. So I think this is a strategic moment for our movements to come together and become much stronger as we move to a world that we want to create and have the resources that we need to create the world we want to see, which is a world that's filled with climate resilience and renewables and no nuclear weapons and enough resources to address, education, racial and economic injustice, all the things we care about. That's what we need to be putting our energy into. We need to come together now. It's part of the movement that Richard referred to. It's what Dimitri referred to. We have to come together domestically and globally in a movement that is going to get our power back and give us the resources we need to build that world that we want to live in and leave for our children.
Yes, thank you. On that note, there's a question for Richard by Yan Sheno. Is there a manifesto that you can fully support, which includes ongoing or proposed treaties? And the person also added, the issue has become very confusing for peace-minded people to get onto a solid plan.
I don't know of any single, what one would call manifesto. I think there, a good place to start is the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I mean, it doesn't address the process by which the weapons will be eliminated. It concentrates on their delegitimation and characterizing them as unlawful to develop, possess, and certainly to threaten or use or to deploy. But I think that would be a constructive mission at this stage in the context of what we've learned from the Ukraine war to draft such a manifesto. And I think that a lot of what we've been trying to say this morning would address, would, if it was done well, would respond to that request.
Yes. Thank you, Richard. Oh, Cynthia, please.
And I agree with what Richard just said, and want to just say that related to this, I want to mention that Global Zero really has come out with a sound and verifiable pathway to get to zero nuclear weapons, which involves the US and Russia coming down to the level of China to start. In other words, the US and Russia coming down to about the level of an estimated 300 nuclear weapons from what is together combined. Now our two countries have, over 12,000 nuclear weapons. And then, going to more reductions after that. And I just want to say that China has declared they will not consider reductions in their arsenals until the US and Russia come down to their level. So I think that, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons does what Richard defined it does. And it bans and makes nuclear weapons illegal. It makes them immoral. It delegitimizes nuclear weapons as an instrument of security, and it calls for their absolute total elimination and makes that a requirement. But there are sound and verifiable pathways to get there that have to be brought into being, and Global Zero has the best one that I've seen.
Yes, thank you. I believe that there's another question by Mari. There's a question by Mari Inoue, which is the following: what should the U.S. do to stop the war in Ukraine? Cynthia, would you like to start?
Could you please repeat that for me?
Oh, what should the U.S. do to stop the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think that what I mentioned in my remarks, and what Richard talked about, I think that we need to couple whatever else we're doing with calls with diplomatic action. I would like to hear our president talking about a ceasefire and the need for a ceasefire. I did not hear that word mentioned over the weekend. I'm not hearing that coming from the United States. I'm not hearing that call to end the war. I want to hear that call. I think that, as I said, words matter. And we need to be, leaders for peace in this world. And I feel that that's something, and I would like to see diplomatic conversations happening again between Foreign Minister Lazaroff and Secretary Blinken. This is an urgent moment for humanity. The two countries that have the greatest, 90%, that hold over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons need to be talking more in this moment. So I think that's the most important thing, is to talk and to really be careful with our words and to put words out that really call for an end to the bloodshed and suffering and killing. I mean, that's what we need to do.
Thank you. Richard, would you like to?
Yes, I agree with Cynthia's emphasis on the language we use as crucially important. And I would just re-emphasize the fact that to the extent this is a conflict between Russia and the US, it's being fought with words. That's the weapon of the moment in this confrontation. And we should stop demonizing the leadership of Russia and the people, the country, the ridiculous anti-Russian sentiments of sending Russian students home, or of banishing Tchaikovsky from concerts and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy from libraries, is a kind of anti-Russian Russophobia that didn't even exist during the Cold War. George W. Bush, who's not my favorite president, at least after 9/11, tried to avoid anti-Islamic hysteria. I haven't heard a word from Biden or the top officials in Washington that seek to draw the distinction between the Russian people and the Russian government, between that recognize that the pluralism of Russia as well as its autocracy. It's very disturbing. And one final point. The geopolitical war I was describing has been a setback for Russia in a number of ways. It's a failed mission. They're Ukrainian. Whatever happens, however it's settled. But for the U.S., it's especially hawkish elements. The longer it goes on, the more it succeeds in this dimension. The more it makes Russia look bad, the more it justifies the demonization and so on. So the geopolitical motivations behind the U.S. posture are really not consistent with what is of benefit to the Ukrainian people. There is this mismatch between stopping the killing and stopping the geopolitical confrontation with Russia. And that's really important to keep in mind. And as far as I know, that distinction has not been prominently observed up to this point.
Yes, thank you, Richard. There's an additional question that was actually posed earlier, which I'm going to ask you. It's by Ursula. Ursula mentions that it looks like there's a master plan to divide Europe and Russia in the interest of U.S. global strategies, disrupting tech exchange and resources, and using Ukraine as a trigger to achieve this. What do you think? And it's a question for both of you. So, Richard, would you like to go first?
Yes, I think it's a important insight into one ramification of the way in which the geopolitical war is being waged. One of the benefits is to strengthen this transatlantic alliance that was damaged a lot during the Trump presidency, and to take economic advantage of that, of the war as a way of achieving this. Whether it was really the trigger or just a consequence is probably unimportant and very difficult to assess, but it certainly is an element that's worth thinking. And I would add to my critique of the irresponsibility of the US leadership the way it has tried somewhat mindlessly to urge this militarist revitalization of a Europe-focused NATO.
Cynthia?
Well, I would echo what Richard said. I agree with what he said. I think I just want to shift where we go from here in this situation. I think it comes back to what lies ahead. How do we move forward? How do we move away from a militarized foreign policy at a time where our survival depends on it, in the face of increased challenges that have been identified by this question, as we are looking at how to survive all the other challenges, the existential threats that we have. And I think it comes back to what we've been saying through this, is that we have to come together in ways that we haven't come together before. And our lives depend on it. Literally our future depends on it. And we have to steer the conversation in that direction, because we haven't really talked in this session much about the implications for policies with our other nuclear adversaries, North Korea, China, et cetera, and where we go in the future there. I mean, we really have to look and learn from this situation and realize that we all share this planet, one small planet. It may sound idealistic, but I want to go back to JFK and his strategy of peace speech, which he gave after he was shaken and awakened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that crisis changed his mind and his heart. And he took that moment to really call for a moment for humanity to come together and rise above our differences, to acknowledge our differences, to acknowledge that we have disagreements that we're not going to solve necessarily, but that we all have shared interests. And our main shared interest is survival. So, and within a few months, within 2 months of giving that speech in June 1963 at American University, the partial nuclear test ban treaty, which had been under negotiation for a number of years, was signed. So we have the chance here, and our leadership, should they be awakened and really seize this moment, can bring us all together. That's what we have to be calling for, that we have to start with a ceasefire. We have to start with ending this war to stop the killing and suffering.
Yes, agreed. So we're only going to take 2 more questions. The next question is for both of you, and it's whether you would both support a movement of nonviolence.
I do.
Well, I do, and I have to go back to Richard as my mentor at Princeton, because we did a whole study of nonviolence, and that was the beginning of my activism as a nonviolence trainer in the anti-nuclear movement. And so I feel like nonviolence is absolutely the way forward. We model what we want to see, and so that's the way forward. Absolutely nonviolence, and we look at the successful movements of nonviolence. We look at Nelson Mandela's calls for nonviolence, and Martin Luther King's calls for nonviolence, and many other leaders, men and women, who have shown us the way forward. So that's the way that we move forward, is we model that world that we want to see.
I would just add Gandhi's phrase, "Be the change you seek," and that implies a nonviolent modality to reach a nonviolent world. The world desperately needs a nonviolent geopolitics, which stresses global solidarity and coming together to meet these common global challenges.
Yes, exactly. And this leads to, it's a final question, which I'm going to combine two questions together. The first one is by Frank. We're gonna, it's like how do we bring together a global movement to awaken the world to the existential threats? How might this happen? Who could best lead it? And then also there's another question is what is currently the most important anti-nuclear weapons movement now? I'll pose those questions to both of you.
Could you repeat the second one?
Oh, sorry, what is the most important anti-nuclear weapons movement now?
I yield to my partner.
Okay, well, let me just say that, you know, I want to go back to the lens that I wear, having come of age in the 1980s for a moment, and say that that I think that we need to come together around an awakening. In the 1980s, it happened. We grew up during the Cold War with duck and cover and things like that, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we also had things like the day after. We had the media playing its role, and then we had the day after the movie, where 100 million of us all watched that movie at the same time on the same night. And it also changed Ronald Reagan's heart. He went from, leading the largest nuclear arms buildup up to that point in history to, within a very short time, less than 2 years, meeting with Gorbachev and talking about the total elimination of nuclear weapons. So I think that we need everyone. We need the media, we need Hollywood, and we need each other. And, Ambassador Elaine White Gomez, who negotiated the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the UN, led those negotiations in 2017, said, history is made by every single step we take every day. We all have to be leaders. It's up to all of us. No act that we take is insignificant. And so what is the most important global anti-nuclear weapons movement right now? I think every one of the movements is important, but I think the most important goal is that we stay focused on what we have to do to get out of the mess we're in. And it's to get rid of these nuclear weapons. That's the only way to get out of this mess. So whatever differences we have in our movements, we have to realize we have these shared interests. And above all, it's to actually, it's first to survive, but it's also to thrive. And so we need to come together beyond, as I mentioned, the peace and anti-nuclear movements and join with all the other movements that are really, we all want the same thing. We want a world that we can leave to our children that's not only inhabitable, but flourishing. And that may seem like a long way to go, but we have to be able to see that and hold that vision to get there.
Richard?
Well, there's little to add to that. I think we both share this sense that it's a visionary moment, that it calls for transformative thinking, that we have to overcome the attachment to national interests as sufficient guide to the future, and as interpreted by militarized elites that are adhering to what I regard as an anarchistic, anachronistic sense of what they call political realism. But I really think it's this kind of militarist nostalgia for the way in which World War II was, the results that were achieved in World War II. And then in the Cold War through different techniques. It's time to recognize that the historical agency of military power has dropped dramatically as a result of the victory of the anti-colonial movement, the defeat of the United States in Vietnam, the defeat of Russia in Afghanistan. There are many reasons to think differently about international politics, but the political elites of the world and their leadership of the world isn't there yet. And it's up to the peace movement, I believe. It's a moment of challenge, but also of responsibility and opportunity. And I see it in that double-edged way that crises often possess, that they both are threatening catastrophe, but they're also giving a chance to liberation and transcendence. And it's seizing that latter possibility that is a challenge to us all.
Yes, well, thank you both so much. And on that note, I would like to conclude this event. I know that we have so many more questions to go through, so we will review and send responses, via email. I'll obviously, share the questions with both of you, Richard and Cynthia. So thank you once again for joining us. And this is just first of many dialogues that we'll be having about
Christian,
Ukraine.
Christian,
Yes.
may I just interrupt to tell people if they want to save the chat so they have all of the great comments people have done, you can do so on your computers on the thing on chat. So if you want to save the chat and then look back at what people have said, you can do that. I just wanted to suggest that, which is what I just did before closing out.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us. And we will look forward to hosting many more events on the situation in Ukraine. And we will be posting this recording on our website. So thank you again for joining us, and special thanks to Cynthia and Richard. Yes. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.